We would like to begin. Thank you all for coming. I know it was not easy. Such a great feeling to be here in the same room with all of you. And with the 450 participants on Zoom. I would like to invite our Dean to open the celebration. Dean Gillian Lester is the 15th Dean of Columbia Law School and Lucy G. Moses Professor of Law since 2015. She is a leading authority on employment law and policy. Dean Lester is an editor of Philosophical Foundations of Labor Law from Oxford University Press, and her widely used co-author casebook, Employment Law, Cases and Materials, is now in its 6th edition. Dean Lester serves on the board of the Legal Aid Society of New York and the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. She also serves on the executive committee of the Association of American Law Schools and is a member of the American Law Institute. We should all be thankful to Gillian, not just because of the generous financial support she provided to this celebration, but also for the enormous effort she made to get the university to allow us to hold this event in person. Please welcome Gillian.
Thank you, Zohar. And before I go any further, I want us to take a moment to recognize Zohar for the time and energy over multiple years that he put into making this event a reality. The depth of his commitment to gathering this group together to pay tribute to Henry came through in our very first conversation. I think it was 2018 that we began this conversation. And I'm just going to say that conversation came from a place of love and honor. And I can tell you the commitment hasn't waned, not for a moment, not because of a pandemic nor the passage of time. So I'm just going to open the conference with an applause for Zohar. It's my great pleasure, more pleasure than I can fully express, to look out at a room full of human beings and welcome you to Columbia. Whether you're up on the screen in front of me and above me, or you're here in the room, it is just such an honor to have you here for this wonderful event. And I want to extend my warm welcome and my thanks. I want to thank in particular our speakers and our moderators who will be filling this weekend with ideas, particularly to Oliver Hart and Bengst Holmstrom, the distinguished Nobel laureates who will deliver keynote addresses during the program. Thank you. And of course, our guest of honor, Henry Hansmann. As all of you know, yes. As all of you know well, Henry is a singular figure in the study of law and economics. His seminal work, The Ownership of Enterprise, helped pioneer the study of organizations. It helped to advance the thinking about their organization and design in ways that broke boundaries and changed the conversation. His scholarship truly helped advance the canon of our knowledge and our deep understanding and all of the foundations on which we have built, those of us who study organizational forms and the ways that they interact with contract law, property law, and other areas of private law theory. In particular, Henry pioneered the study of nonprofit law, an area that was scarcely recognized, was not really in people's minds before Henry's incisive and prescient scholarly interventions. And it is, of course, a tremendous privilege for Columbia to be able to host this tribute to Henry. Although Henry's not a member of our faculty, his influence can be seen coursing through the veins of our intellectual community. Many of our faculty members, including several who will participate in the substantive program over the next 2 days, have been deeply influenced and inspired by Henry's towering contributions to knowledge, but also and especially to his generous mentorship. Thank you all again for joining us, and congratulations to Henry on this much-deserved celebration. Let me turn the podium now back to Zohar.
Thank you, Gillian. Organizing this celebration for Henry's book was hard because of COVID, but was easy because of the book and Henry. Why COVID made it hard, it's obvious. Why it was easy for the book, because Ownership of Enterprise is a seminal book with a powerful theory that once you read it, it is very hard to think differently about ownership. For Henry, because anyone that I asked to participate responded the same way. For Henry, of course, a clear reflection of Henry's novel scholarship and generous personality. But honoring Henry is also very personal to me. Henry was my teacher, the supervisor of my JSD, and now a colleague and a close friend. His influence on my academic career started back then in 1990 when I stepped to his office and I asked him to supervise my JSD dissertation. What is it about, he asked. Dividend policy in inefficient markets, I answered. It was at the time before noise trading models when efficient market theory was the dominant paradigm. But with his academic openness and generosity, he answered, it will be hard, but let's give it a try. And since then, he did not stop assisting me in every step of the academic road. Thank you, Henry. And please, let's start the first panel. Kate, it will be moderated by Kathryn Judge.
Welcome. Well, thank you to Zohar and Gillian for kicking this wonderful event off. Thank you, of course, to Henry. We are privileged to start it off with a wonderful panel. I'm not going to provide extensive bios, which would suck up way too much time. And we have so many more valuable things to discuss. Each of the panelists is going to speak for roughly 15 minutes, and they very graciously agreed to reduce their opening comments, so that way we really do have time for conversation. So if you have questions that arise, make sure to keep them in the back of your mind, and then we will open it up to Q&A after the initial comments. We'll be proceeding alphabetically in the order that you see on the handout for the day. And so we'll be starting with John Armour, joining us from Oxford.
Hi, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure and privilege to be able to participate in this wonderful event. And I want to start by just conveying my enormous gratitude, firstly to Zohar and the other organizers for putting this together, and more fundamentally to Henry for all that he's done for me in my academic career. And like Zohar, I very clearly remember the first time I met Henry by fortunate circumstance. When I arrived at Yale Law School, he was my academic advisor, and I had been interested in doing a course on law and economics that year, but it wasn't running for whatever reason. So Henry actually agreed to give me one-on-one sessions going through some key ideas, which, the generosity that involved and the impact that it had, I can't really begin to describe. So I'm going to begin, because by happy circumstance of alphabet, I'm first. I'm going to just say a couple of words about the book itself. This is probably completely unnecessary, but I thought, as the first person up, it's worth just doing this. And so the research question is fundamentally how do we best explain observed patterns of ownership of enterprise? What are the factors that determine why patrons are owners and which group of patrons are assigned ownership? And ownership is taken to mean the formal rights to control and the allocation of residual profits. The method that Henry uses is grounded in observation, and I think this is a key point and something that was quite different from a lot of the literature. And Riley, on the first page of the preface, he remarks, in studying any given organizational form, I've generally followed the simple practice of first examining the range of situations in which that form is found, and then looking for theories that can explain the observed pattern. Although this might seem the obvious thing to do, a good deal of contemporary work in organizational theory has not proceeded that way. And so this observationally based method then develops a theory which perhaps we could call the lowest cost assignment of ownership. That ownership goes to the group of patrons whose allocation of the ownership rights will minimize the sum of the costs of contracting with non-owner patrons and the costs of ownership for the owners. So the key contribution, as I take it, to the theoretical literature is the focus on ownership costs, that is the costs of collective decision making, as an explanatory variable, because as the book makes clear, focus on contracting costs was already with non-owner patrons was already common in the literature. And then the empirically central case discussed, I say empirically central because that's the one that is empirically most frequently observed, is the public corporation, where the sole focus on shareholder value, understood in dollar terms, which are facilitated by efficient capital markets, means that ownership costs for financiers, that is shareholders, are lower than any other stakeholder, so that the homogeneity of shareholder interest keeps the ownership costs down, which facilitates ownership by patrons who supply capital. But that's just the starting point, because the breadth of the book is its unrivaled analysis, unrivaled to this day, of empirically penumbral cases. So the full panoply of different organizational setups, employee ownership, cooperatives, customer ownership, non-profits. And this analytic framework and the applications go beyond the regnant paradigm of agency costs and the Berlin means corporation, regnant in the 90s and 2000s, to give an account for the full range of enterprise ownership. And I really want to just say that I think that 25 years on, we're at a point where agency costs and the Berlin means corporation are now something that we're thinking about. Well, where are we going next? What's happening in the world? That framework may no longer be what can help us to explain and understand things that are happening. And the analytic tools in the ownership of enterprise will, I think, long outlive and provide utility in dealing with very contemporary challenges that go beyond focusing solely on dispersed share ownership. Before I say a couple of examples of this, I want to just also pay tribute to the exposition. So the ownership of enterprise is distinguished not solely by the significance of its contribution, which indeed is very significant, as I've sought to say, but also by the sheer beauty of the writing. And every time I get a graduate student who is struggling or wants to know how to write better, I say, well, you should read The Ownership of Enterprise. That's a model of how to write well. So the ideas are developed with extraordinary care, presented methodically and fluidly. Henry has a scientific commitment to freedom from ideological commitments. That means that the work is always more persuasive. And he takes prior work exhaustively into account, but he doesn't exhaustively reiterate it. And that means that his own thoughts come across very clearly to the reader. And then what I think is really exceptional about it is how stark the conclusions are, but how free from overstatement they are. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to do, as we all know. And I think it's a truly remarkable piece of work, which for these reasons, both in terms of form and substance, is incredibly relevant still today. So I want just quickly to touch on two current applications, two modish applications that I happen to have been working on. But the thing is, even before Zohar asked me if I'd be interested in participating, which of course I was, Henry's book actually I found to be a perfect starting point for addressing projects in looking at these two very current applications. So the first is artificial intelligence. And what I mean by that is systems that are characterized by their ability to substitute for some degree for tasks ordinarily done using the human brain. And so this technical capacity means that automated systems are now, for the first time, impacting seriously on the work of knowledge and professional workers. And so within the domain of professional workers, one field that I've been studying recently is the legal profession. And law firm ownership is picked out as one of the empirically exceptional cases where employee ownership is the norm in Henry's book. Now, of course, there is a regulatory constraint in many states that push in favor of the partnership form. But this has been relaxed in some jurisdictions like Australia and the UK. Nevertheless, most major law firms are still organized as partnerships. And the ownership of enterprise gives us, the theory developed in the ownership of enterprise gives us an economic explanation for this, even in the absence of regulatory constraints. So on the one hand, the ownership costs for employees are low where the employees are all lawyers, because individual lawyer productivity, that is the thing that needs to be monitored, is relatively easy to measure in a homogeneous fashion with the billable hour metric that's used in most law firms. And lawyers also all have a similar training, a similar perspective on the world relative to people who are not lawyers. So they have a relatively homogeneous interest, which the ownership of enterprise explicitly recognizes as being, to some degree, a social construct. At the same time, the contracting costs for finance are relatively low because a law firm whose main asset is human capital, which can't be alienated, which can't be bought, has a relatively modest demand for outside finance. So low ownership costs for employees and low contracting costs for finance mean that employee ownership is a stable equilibrium for law firms. AI technology has the potential to change that. So in my recent work with Mary Sarko and Richard Parnham, we've argued that the introduction of technology in ways that are central to the bottom line of a legal services firm has impacts both on ownership costs for employees and contracting costs for finance. So the ownership costs of employee ownership go up where the firm becomes where the firm's revenues or business model become more fundamentally dependent on technology. That's because the technology doesn't just substitute for humans, doesn't just push them aside. The implementation of the technology also generates new tasks for humans. So the design of the technology, its implementation, its operation, quality control, review, interpretation. And these tasks require people with different disciplinary expertise apart from lawyers, and they have to work together with people with legal expertise. So it requires a multidisciplinary team. The human capital mix becomes more plural, therefore more heterogeneous, therefore ownership costs by employees increase. At the same time, the contracting costs of finance likely also increase because these tech systems require investment of capital to implement effectively. So the modish term digital transformation encompasses the restructuring of a firm's processes around data capture and control in order to be able best to exploit this in the value generation. So this increases the demand of the organization for outside capital, result that the equilibrium in which employees are owners can no longer be seen as such a stable one. So we would predict changes in the ownership structure of, or the allocation of ownership in legal services firms where technology is sufficiently important to the firm's business model. We observe in the legal services sector new business models making use of advanced technology such as AI. These have multidisciplinary teams, and they are predominantly organized using a corporate form. At the same time, many law firms have chosen simply to focus on the human-centric tasks that still remain uniquely capable of being done by human lawyers, and they remain as partnerships. But they buy in the services produced by the new entrants who are employing multidisciplinary teams and organized as corporates. So we find this with both a mix of qualitative and quantitative findings, but the prediction going forwards would be that as the domain of legal services which can be delivered using technical systems increases, empirically the fraction of legal services firms that are organized as corporates which facilitate these multidisciplinary teams, or which accommodate these multidisciplinary teams with their higher or their greater heterogeneity of perspective and the greater need for outside capital to finance the technical assets, we would expect to see more firms organized as corporates. So the second example of contemporary relevance, and I'm just very quickly going to introduce this, and just we can come back to it maybe in the Q&A, is the climate crisis. And here we've got large firms in some industries like fossil fuel producers, pastoral agriculture firms, cement producers, that are emitting far greater than the average quantities of greenhouse gases. So a striking stylized fact is that the top 20 greenhouse gas emitting firms produce 35% of entire global emissions over the period 1965 to 2018. And these firms have been termed, in some contexts, systemically important carbon emitters. So these firms are creating massive externalities for the rest of society, including other firms. First best solution for them is internalization by regulation, such as internationally agreed carbon taxes. But if we wait for the first best, we're all going to be dead, to paraphrase Keynes. So one potential development here that holds some promise is the growth of what we might call climate regarding shareholders. We can distinguish these from traditional or climate indifferent shareholders who care just about within firm profit maximization. For them, the externalities of systemically important carbon emitters, to the extent that they're not internalized by regulation, are not their problem. But climate regarding shareholders might encompass ESG funds, which plausibly are marketed to end investors whose preferences trade off to some degree profits for greenhouse gas reduction, and possibly common owners who are trying to maximize the returns across their entire portfolio rather than just the within firm profit maximization. And as such, the externalities are picked up in the rest of their portfolio. So the implication I think that the ownership of enterprise has for this is that this division of shareholders regarding the treatment of greenhouse gas emissions by systemically important carbon emitters means that the shareholder interests are plausibly more heterogeneous. And that creates challenges for the standard model of governance. And I'm conscious I'm at time, so I'm not going to go into or elaborate on those. I'm just going to put that out there as a conjecture, and I'll stop now. But I hope what I've done is demonstrate a couple of examples of the salience of Henry's contribution to engagement with research today.
All right. Well, thank you, John, for starting us off so well with a great background and some wonderful examples. I particularly like the second one where we're leading into a conversation of really the role of intermediaries in expressing and aggregating shareholder and other stakeholder interests. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Ryan Bubb, who's joining us from NYU.
Okay. Well, good morning. Thank you to Zohar and the other organizers for inviting me. It's a real honor to get to share with you some of my reflections on ownership of enterprise 25 years on. I vividly remember reading the book for the first time. It was when I was in a Starbucks in Washington, D.C. I really do have this image. It was winter break of my second year in law school. And I remember finding it incredibly intellectually exciting. I had the impression that Henry was some sort of Jedi using the force of economic theory to explain the world in a way that was almost magical. And it's no exaggeration to say that the book inspired me to pursue a career as a social scientist and as a law professor. And reading it again in preparation for this gathering, I felt that same sense of excitement anew. And so rather than give you a retrospective take on the influence of the book, I'd like to be prospective and just share with you some thoughts the book provoked in me on this latest read. And what I'd like to propose is the following, admittedly somewhat speculative conjecture, that viewing Henry's theory of enterprise ownership from a public finance perspective, meaning through the standard normative lens in economics for thinking about the design of public policy, might reveal new opportunities to further apply the ideas in ownership of enterprise in ways that enrich our understanding both of policy design and perhaps of enterprise ownership itself. So in the book, as John nicely recounted, Henry develops a positive theory of enterprise ownership based on the use of ownership as a device to address certain social problems that arise from the transactions between a firm and various classes of customers and suppliers of the firm. Those social problems include those stemming from market power, from asymmetric information, and various other forms of market failure. And the basic idea is that in some cases, those market failures can be usefully mitigated by giving the class of firm patrons in question ownership rights, or maybe even simply by not giving ownership rights to some class of firm patrons who might use those rights to induce the firm to behave in a particularly opportunistic fashion. And so at the heart of the theory is the use of ownership as a private ordering institution for solving social problems. I'm going to advance the slides. Let's see here. It's not, Here we go. So here's a formal representation of the basic model. This is taken essentially lifted right out of the endnotes. As I'm sure you all know, it's an informal analysis in the book, but Henry gave us some math in the endnotes. So under his theory, enterprise ownership will be assigned to a class of firm patrons in order to minimize the sum of the cost of ownership for that class. That's the C superscript O in the notation, and the sum of the cost of market contracting for those classes of firm patrons who are not owners. Now, importantly, the costs of these transactions between the firm and its various classes of patrons depend on a set of background institutions, including law and public policy. And I've made that explicit now in the formal representation. You can see I've made those costs now a function of P, capital P, where capital P denotes some vector, some set of social institutions. Now, Henry doesn't use this notation or formalize this point in the book, but he nonetheless points out repeatedly in the book that the solution to the enterprise ownership optimization problem can change as these other institutional arrangements evolve. So for example, he argues that in the period prior to the advent of modern prudential regulation, the efficient assignment of ownership of banks was to depositors in order to mitigate moral hazard problems between the bank and its depositors. But when the government stepped in to protect depositors with regulation and insurance, the efficient assignment of ownership changed. It shifted to investors. Hence, we then saw a shift of deposits from mutually owned financial institutions to investor-owned institutions. Consider then how we might incorporate Henry's theory of endogenous enterprise ownership in an analysis of optimal policy. So from a policy perspective, we want to choose the vector of policies P to minimize the total sum of the cost of market contracting and the cost of ownership, given the endogenous response of enterprise ownership. And so you can see here, I've tried to add that very simply to the framework by adding an additional policy problem outside the inner enterprise ownership optimization problem. And the hope is that embedding the positive model, Henry's positive model of enterprise ownership, in a normative model of policy design might produce useful insights and raise a set of fruitful questions. So for example, if we go back to this period prior to the advent of modern prudential regulation, we shouldn't think of the benefits of introducing prudential regulation just in terms of the effect it would have on investor-owned banks. For one, prudential regulation will induce a flow of deposits from mutual banks to investor-owned banks. So the actual benefits of regulation are, at least in one respect, smaller, since at mutual banks, depositors already had some degree of protection, certainly greater than did the depositors of investor-owned banks in the absence of regulation. On the other hand, if there are other efficiencies created by shifting from mutually owned banks to investor-owned banks, perhaps from a reduction in managerial agency costs, those should be counted as among the benefits of prudential regulation. So now let me just suggest two specific questions raised by this public finance perspective on ownership of enterprise. So first, in Henry's analysis, a key primitive is the contrast between the costs of market contracting on the one hand, between the firm and some class of firm patrons, and the cost of ownership if that class of firm patrons is assigned ownership rights. And so loosely speaking, and to simplify a bit, I hope Henry will forgive my oversimplification of his theory. The theory predicts that ownership will generally be assigned to the class of firm patrons for which the resulting reduction in the cost of transacting with the firm by giving them ownership rights is particularly large. But embedding the analysis of enterprise ownership in an optimal policy framework naturally leads to another set of comparative institutional design questions. How do government regulation and ownership compare as alternative governance institutions for solving particular social problems, and in particular for protecting various classes of firm patrons? What are the relative advantages of each? So consider, for example, the safety of motor vehicles. The design and manufacture of motor vehicles is, of course, a major subject of federal regulation, which imposes a host of requirements intended to make cars safer. So why is regulation used there rather than assigning ownership of the firm to its customers? Presumably, more generally, information costs are at the heart of the comparative advantages of regulation and ownership as social devices for mitigating market failures. Loosely speaking, regulation is more effective when it is cheap for the state to collect and process information needed to implement a first best outcome or something close to it. That is, when information is fairly centralized. In contrast, when the relevant information is more decentralized, it makes more sense to rely on ownership rather than regulation to mitigate market failures. Now, I'd like to be able to tell you that I've thought about this big picture question deeply and thoroughly and have developed a grand unified theory of all institutional design, and it's only due to the short-sightedness of the organizers who limited me to 15 minutes, I'm not able to spell it all out for you right now. But sadly, that isn't so. Second, and relatedly, really, I was realizing in the car this morning, In Henry's positive theory, ownership is assigned in order to maximize the size of the pie for firm patrons. But firms pose other types of social problems that don't factor in to the equilibrium ownership assignment in Henry's model. And therefore, that I've omitted from the policy problem when I just did this simple thing of adding another minimization outside of the positive model and retain the same objective function that drives the predictions in Henry's framework. So what's missing from this? Well, one, the operation of firms produces costs and benefits for non-firm patrons. In other words, firms produce externalities. And Henry's theory tells us that enterprise ownership is not a particularly apt social institution for addressing that problem. There's a reason Henry omitted externalities from the objective function of his positive model. Second, firms produce a particular distribution of income and welfare across firm patrons. And as a normative matter, we might care about those distributive outcomes. And again, enterprise ownership is not a useful social institution, I think, certainly under Henry's theory, for addressing distributive concerns. Which leads me finally to a set of new ideas. And this, I think, dovetails nicely with John's presentation. A set of new ideas that attempt to push enterprise ownership to do more than Henry's theory suggests it can do. So over the last few years, two schools of thought have emerged that try to reform our understanding of enterprise ownership in order to adapt it to address both externalities and distributive concerns. So first, Madison Condon and Jeff Gordon, I think Jeff's here somewhere. I think I saw him, there he is, back right, have each articulated a vision of investor ownership in which the company is managed to maximize diversified shareholders' portfolio value. Most shareholders of public companies are, of course, highly diversified, increasingly so. And from this perspective, the actual interests of a firm's shareholders are in terms of that diversified portfolio value, not the value of the firm's shares. So managing the firm to maximize the value of shareholders' portfolios in turn might lead firms to cut back on negative externalities. John already sort of introduced this idea earlier. It might as well motivate firms to some extent to treat firm patrons better in ways that might improve distributive outcomes. So for example, firms are thought to underinvest in worker training since they're not able to recoup all of the social gains from worker training given worker mobility. But if part of that social return is captured by other firms, then the portfolio value maximization approach might lead to more efficient levels of worker training and perhaps more attractive distributive outcomes as well. And then second, Oliver Hart, who's here, and Luigi Zingales, who might be here as well, they're also here, point out that public company shareholders care about more than just their own wealth. They have social and ethical concerns. They care about the environment. They care about social justice, inequality, racial justice, and so forth. And so corporate fiduciaries, in their view, should manage the corporation not to maximize shareholder wealth, which is the conventional view, but rather to maximize shareholder welfare, incorporating shareholder social preferences. And so again, these new ideas offer hope that the institution of enterprise ownership might evolve beyond the role it plays in Henry's book to address these additional social concerns that are conventionally understood to be matters of public policy. But I don't think so. And for reasons that are essentially given in Henry's book, and John picked up on this a bit in his remarks. So shareholders have substantial differences in the portfolios they hold and their social preferences, so that understanding the interests of shareholders in these terms means that shareholders have conflicting preferences about the firm's operations. And when those preferences of the owners of a firm are heterogeneous, Henry tells us that the costs of collective decision-making rise. It can result in costly decisions by the firm that actually don't maximize the welfare of shareholders. And as well, it can be very costly for owners to participate effectively in such governance processes, given the information needed. And so these new conceptualizations of enterprise ownership, I would submit, threaten to undermine a key advantage of investor ownership identified by Henry, which is that it produces a single well-defined objective to maximize the net present value of the earnings of the firm. So I'll just leave you with a quote from the book. I'm tempted to read it. I'm already probably over time, forgive me. So I won't read it to you, but I'll let you read it as I put down. Thank you so much again for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Thank you so much, Ryan, for thoughtful comments, as we would expect nonetheless, a whole host of interesting questions that we can address. I thought you were going to talk about ownership structure as a regulatory strategy and how much that might actually explain. And we actually do see a lot of the banking space and Federal Home Loan Banks and GSEs. So with those range of thoughts in our minds, we will now shift to Roberta Romano, who's joining us from Yale.
So my brief personal note is the best thing of being at Yale all these years has been having Henry as a colleague. I thought I would frame mine in the celebratory spirit. I've framed my remarks in what I refer to as an anniversary jingle. It's really an anniversary jingle because this is what we say at the event from which we start counting anniversaries, or at least, I guess I was told someone didn't get this. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue is what we say about brides at weddings. So I'm going to start with something old, something new. There's two words here, so I'm going to have two examples. My first example is, when we think about corporations, one of the things that we ask our students in our classes, we say, well, to whom should directors have a fiduciary duty? Or who should elect the directors? And of course, those questions are really the question of Henry's book, who should be the owners of the corporation? And I remember when I was sort of thinking about this, and you sort of say, what are the theories for this? When starting out, I read this technical article by economists to show a model that, well, risk sharing is the issue, or risk bearing, and the workers are risk averse, shares are diversified, so that's their explanation. And then there was Ollie Williamson's, and maybe that makes sense, but workers, eventually they could borrow, they could diversify some of their income, but is that really a good answer? Maybe. Ollie Williamson had an article in '84 in the Yale Law Journal arguing that stock is a transaction-specific asset. Now, there is a locked-in story about that, but it always seems sort of strange because stock is a pretty liquid asset, so it doesn't really seem to have much relation-specific content in a firm. And then there was Henry's argument, and the argument to me that was so persuasive is his argument that in ownership, the cost of collective decision-making matter, and the shareholders are the most homogeneous group that should make this decision. And so I want to connect this first to the shareholder or the stakeholder debate. At the time of Henry's book, right, and the examples that flow through it were worker participation or worker democracy. And his book goes to that very question about who should be running the firm, who should make those decisions, why shareholders own the firm and not workers. And this was also part of an old debate, Ralph Nader's United Nations kind of board of directors, or should we adopt co-determination? And he has an explanation for why we only see that in firms where it's mandated, because it doesn't make sense from what is the ideal way to sort of structure such an organization. That's the old part, but to me, there's also a new part. So if we look at sort of the current debate about ESG and sustainability and the like, that's really, maybe it's inevitable that topics cycle or recycle themselves in corporate law, but that's a current debate that really is back to that same old debate, yet people haven't gone back to sort of rereading or thinking about Henry's book. Now, maybe some of them were born after the book was published, or there's some opportunistic careerism, of Larry Fink and the like. But it really sort of struck me in rereading his book that we actually need people to reread that book. It tells us sort of what we can expect of corporations and what we should expect of corporations. And I guess sort of in this way, I'm sort of similar with Ryan. So I was going to say, and that's to me why the climate part of John's comments that's why I don't think firms are where that solution lies. And I was going to say that about you when you first cited Luigi and Oliver's papers and like, but in the end, we're on the sort of the same wavelength about thinking about Henry's book. And that should be usefully brought into current debates about what we can expect corporations to do on these issues. My second example, since there's two parts to this, something old and something new, was on rereading. And so when I always think about Henry's paper, and when I teach it in my class, I refer to the collective decision-making. And of course, that is at the heart. But in rereading it, I really thought this was very close to sort of thinking about Coase and the nature of the firm, because he's really thinking about the decision of contracts, right? When he's contrasting market, contracting costs to ownership costs. That's really that fundamental question. And he's got a great answer for that in his book that's very persuasive about that. And so it's something that, I've always sort of remembered the collective aspect, because that's the key here. But that wasn't something that I had really sort of remembered about in reading the book. And just it's such a, the kind of things in his book are things that you haven't thought of before. And once you see them, it's like a revelation. And then you just say, well, why didn't I think about that? It's so lucid and it's so carefully built up. And so my second sort of thing, so that's just something old, though, that gave me a new gloss on it. I'm thinking about it. The other thing, though, to me that was new was, maybe I forgot about it or I didn't pay attention to about it, but his theory about the performing arts and why donations are sort of a key aspect of their financial support. And to me, this rang true. So the Chamber Society of Lincoln Center, which is pretty nearby here, I'm a subscriber to them, and I also contribute to them. And so I say, well, why do I do that? And we say, oh, tax deduction, maybe some consumption. So a few years ago, I stopped itemizing when they changed the tax law, but I still gave my contribution. So it's not really taxes. And then in the pandemic, there was nothing to go to, but I still gave them my minimal contribution. So I'm thinking about that. Well, I don't really have a theory about what it does to them, except, well, donations, they could use the money. And Henry sort of gave me a new perspective on this. So that, to make it humorous, I say, I didn't realize I was contributing to price discrimination effectively. But it really was a revelation to think about it. The Chamber Society is in a very small theater. It's a lovely theater, but it's small. They don't do many repeat performances. So Bach's great work, the Brandenburgs, they do it only 3 times a year in December. If you think about Broadway, which is the comparison Henry is making, they'll do 8 performances a night of the same performance over years in a big theater. And his sort of story was that you can't, it's costly to do these performances. They can't have ticket prices high enough to cover their costs. So you say, like, why don't people give money to, charitable contributions to Broadway shows? And they don't, right? But they can raise their costs. And the non-performing people, the performing people, nonprofit performing arts, they can't raise ticket prices enough to cover their costs. And they can't really price discriminate on this. So the way they do that is by donations. And I think that's an interesting story from thinking about it from their perspective. And then we have to say, would you pay $1,000? Let's just take up any figure. Would you pay $1,000 for a ticket? Or would you pay $200 and then you give $800 as a charitable contribution because it makes you feel good or something like that? And you might not feel good if you're paying that much for a ticket, but it completely is consistent sort of in thinking about the sort of demand or the consumer side with his theory about why this works for these organizations. So to me, that was sort of something that maybe I wasn't into music when I read his book. It went past me in thinking about that. And it was something that was new to me and just makes, as I said, with all of these examples, once you realize this, you say, well, of course that makes sense. But I've never thought that before. So that's my old and something new idea. But it really, for those of us in corporate law, many of us here, it's a major contribution to the field. And we didn't have to have the book to say it was a major contribution. And that goes to my something borrowed idea, although I'm going to focus on nonprofits because I segued into it. But I think sort of for many people, they are fortunate to make one contribution in their lifetime. And Henry, in his founding, the building blocks of this book were contributions without having to put them together in the book. And let me say a word about that nonprofit, which has already been mentioned, his theory of nonprofits, which no one before and after can ever come to that sort of major contribution of understanding nonprofits. And we think of how bizarre it is to have entities that have this non-distribution constraint. So there's no owners. And how could they ever, make sense? And Henry makes sense about that. The asymmetric information, actually people are concerned, right? We don't have owners, but there is still a monitoring issue. And the monitoring issue, sort of the interesting thing is the reversal. It's not the owners, but the people that we're giving the benefits to. How do we sort of figure out that they get them? And this was a contribution. So as I'm going to say, if he never wrote this book, we'd still be honoring Henry. This is a major contribution. But there's difference, and it expands in this book. So if you go back and read his Yale Law Journal article on it, the continuum that he puts up about nonprofits goes from clubs to nonprofits. The continuum in the ownership of enterprise is not from clubs to nonprofits, but it's from the public corporation and its dispersed shareholders to nonprofits. So we've gone vastly beyond what any of these little sort of, and they're not little, any of the major contributions in his individual works are, to a completely major contribution to our understanding of organizations. It's not just a theory of ownership of enterprise, it is a theory of all organizations and why they are in that way. And if you don't believe me about how impressive this work is and how important its contribution, and that leads me to my something blue, which is for the color of my slide. So if we think about what makes articles important for law review citations, you can be a major contribution in law if you're doing translation. So we've got some economics idea, and then we translate what the economists have said for a law review audience. Or synthesis, we take some works together and we synthesize other people's works, or even advocacy. But to be a major paper that's cited in a non-legal set of journals, right? You have to make an original contribution. And it's not just to law, it's something to economics in general, or social science in general. And the ratio of these citations says it all to me, that if we look at that, Henry's got a large number, more than most people in their life have in a non-legal citation set compared to the legal citations. And this is sort of, to me, evidence of how original the work was and how a major contribution, all of his work in these little pieces and its expansion and elaboration and innovation in the book itself. So let me close with a celebratory note. We're happy at 25 years and we hope for another 25 years as well.
Yet another wonderful set of comments. And closing off our initial comments before we get to conversation is my colleague, Chuck Sable.
So it's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here. Henry is a remarkable person and an extraordinary thinker. I want to start by echoing completely what John Armour said about the combination in Henry of rigor, relentless rigor in argumentation and subtlety of mind, and complete openness and curiosity about the world, because it produces a combination of structure and exhortation to exploration, which is, for me, truly remarkable. And as somebody who often aspires but fails to do something similar, I can just say that it's with special appreciation that I acknowledge a master at it. Now, I will confess, and this is a mark of my relation to this group, that this is the first time I've read The Ownership of Enterprise. I don't have the pleasure and advantage of having reread it, but I did have the deep pleasure of reading it as a palimpsest, being able to recall what my earlier reaction would have been, and combining it with understanding of how to proceed forward. And what I would like to do is make two observations. The first about the perspective of the book, and especially what the book says about Henry's relation to Coase. As Roberta said, that there's a Coasean note certainly in the beginning, but I think the perspective shifts radically and fruitfully away from Coase to something different, an idea of the enterprise as a productive community. And then I want to say something in the spirit of a number of the remarks about pressing forward with the framework, though I don't want to do it in the direction of ESG and a richer notion of what shareholders might or might not do. I want to stay focused on Henry's, what I take to be his core idea of elaborating the very notion of productive community when the conditions of production change, as Henry, in fact, knew they would. And here, just to illustrate the breadth of I only read this because nobody else did. The book ends. This is how it ends. And as people who have recently finished books will tell you. I'm one of them. The last paragraph in a book is your lunge at saying what you really wanted to say in the book, and now can get away with at the end because the reader is too exhausted to check. And this is how Henry ends the book. Freedom of enterprise, he means the ability to configure the firm as one will for whatever combination of reasons, is a fundamental characteristic of the most advanced modern economies. Capitalism, meaning investor ownership of the firm, is contingent. It is simply the particular form of patron ownership that most often, but by no means always, proves efficient with the technologies presently at hand. That's the spirit of the book, is to explain why ownership is it is, while constantly alerting us to the possibilities that it could be otherwise. So first, the shift in perspective. Coase, I don't hesitate to say this before this audience, but Coase is obsessed with solving a problem in economics. Though he had great natural curiosity and cruised the United States looking deeply at examples of industrial organization, in the nature of the firm, he wants to fix a hole in economics. And the hole in economics is there are firms, they are aggregations of power, they are based on organization, and they don't appear in economic theory. Economic theory is resolutely marginalist, and he knows both these things are true. Economic theory in its marginalist form is true. The existence of the firm is indisputable. And so he comes up with an ingenious, brilliant, maybe misleading way of integrating the firm into economic theory by saying that there's something that is conserved across market transactions and organizational transactions. That's the transaction. Its price changes under various circumstances. When the price changes appropriately, the decision maker, following the traditional marginalist calculus, switches from outside contract to inside contracting. So while the nature of the firm itself is not explained by economics, the choice to create a firm at the boundary is, and that's, you can say, a gain for economics. Some will say that's a triumph of science, an extension of the frontier. Another way to look at it is the way that Alfred Chandler did. He, in reading the transaction cost literature, his reaction was, it's not the same transaction. When you organize transactions, it's not the more rapid delivery of oil that distinguishes one kind of a traditional refinery from a mass production refinery. It's what happens to the oil once it's delivered. So the notion that the transaction is conserved is itself misleading. Let's leave that. And of course, the Coasean tradition is carried forward, just as Roberta suggested, in the obsession with the make-buy decision, because it has a marginalist feel to it. You could do either, and there's a marginalist calculus determining which you do. Henry's perspective is, he's interested not in solving the economic problem. He wants to understand the ownership of the firm. And he comes up with a substantive theory. It's not just a framework, it's a theory that ownership is determined by the relations of the patrons of the firms to the firm itself. So the benchmark model is of a firm that can contract for everything, inputs and sell goods on the market, but because of peculiarities in its relations to particular groups of patrons, suppliers or customers, those patrons demand ownership rights, and collaterally, the firm itself might, in some transactions, want to be self-owning, that is, to make things rather than buy things. The interplay of these relations, and they are market failures of various kinds, has been noted, asymmetries and monopsony and monopoly and control rights and so on, the usual suspects. That interplay determines the actual allocation of control and cash flow rights. Okay, so that's the model. It's no longer really marginalist. It's a substantive model of the firm. And by its own terms, it depends entirely on the changing nation of, oh, sorry, okay. So that brings me to my second point. my second point is that Henry develops this idea in two different directions. One is the direction of a typology, which by its nature is closed. When you typologize all the existing forms of property, as he wonderfully does, you're suggesting a kind of closure, that you've encompassed the totality of possibilities. But as the quote that I read you suggests, Henry is constantly counteracting the effect of this, what would otherwise be a totalizing and limiting view. And it's in that spirit that I want to point to recent work that carries the idea, Henry's idea of patronage ownership forward. So first, the first thing I want to call attention to is the main thing is the fact of uncertainty. Henry is describing a basically stable world where patrons and firms interact in a stable way. Once you introduce rapid technological change, raw uncertainty, the impossibility of knowing what will happen in the future, the nature of the relation of the firm to its patrons and the very question of who is a patron of a firm become open. Let me give you two quick examples. First, Zohar's recent and terrific work on concentrated blocks and principle and conflicts among principles. The notion in Zohar's, and I confess, I know and deeply admire Zohar, and I know to a lesser extent, but admire as deeply Henry. I didn't fully understand what seems to me like a deep intellectual affiliation until I read The Ownership of Enterprise and see the, at least from my own perspective, Zohar developing the core idea of a productive community. So Zohar takes the case of an entrepreneur who has a vision that can't be communicated to investor owners. They simply don't understand it, or I would say more accurately, the entrepreneur doesn't really have a plan. The entrepreneur has a vision that motivates people who have affinities with it, Steve Jobs, Henry Ford. And it isn't that these people have plans. When you read the detailed history, they don't have a plan. They build a team, they develop a community. In fact, there's a recent interpretation of Henry Ford by which the $5 day is not macroeconomics. The $5 day is largely to consecrate, memorialize, institutionalize the community of the firm. Under those circumstances, the entrepreneur, or as the representative of this community, gets special rights, and ownership turns into is more exclusive than it would be in the normal course of things, where the investor owners can effectively control. That's one example. The second example is from the work that Ron and Bubb and have done, which is about contracting for innovation, where the community is even more open. There is a firm, there's a potential collaborator. Together, they may develop an innovation, and they develop forms of contracting which allow them to explore that possibility and ultimately allocate cash flow rights. So it's a way of we didn't say this in our work because we were not attentive to Henry's perspective, but we should have been. It's a way in which the community opens itself in a way that preserves its integrity while exploring the possibility of incorporating new patrons, redirecting cash flows and rights. And my hunch is, quite apart from all the ESG considerations, as the core productive community of the firm continues to change. There was a hint of it in John's interesting discussion of AI and the introduction of teamwork. As that continues to change, Henry's framework will get an application that expands its boundaries while redeeming its fundamental insights. Thanks.
All right. Thank you to all four of our panelists. This has been an incredible start to the day already. I don't know about anybody else, but I thought I had all these insights from the book itself. And now my mind is already racing, understanding when the role of the government to provide alternative forms, and then whether or not they should actually be playing a more active role in facilitating change among those forms when technology suddenly opens up potentially new frontiers, where it's actually changing ownership structure, as opposed to other types of intervention that might allow us to achieve what we're trying to societally achieve. Before we kind of get down into all those wonderful rabbit holes that we've already had laid out for us, I would love to take a step back and return to where John started us off, and where a number of the comments already alluded to, which is that the incredible contributions were not only this framework of understanding and thinking through ownership, which is so fundamental, but also this methodological gift that potentially could be used in so many other ways. As Roberta noted, not only has the book had a profound impact on legal academia, it's had an impact across different domains. And that was true from the moment it was published. I had a RA pull up a number of all of the book reviews that were contemporaneously published. And I will say it spanned domains. And so you had historians and sociologists, along with economists and legal academics, all talking. Of course, they're academics, so they're all critical and find some shortcoming. And yet every single one of them saw in his work profound insights that their field had not yet understood and would be enriched by better understanding. And so the nature of being able to make that type of contribution, unlike others, I revisited something I had read but too long ago, and was similarly struck, I think similarly to others, but what I personally saw is both breadth and depth feeding into each other rather than one coming at the expense of the other. And it's related to Chuck's point about both rigor and nuance. And of course, in trying to understand what allowed this to be a profound impact, I found that Henry Hansmann himself had actually summed up quite well part of what made it so impactful, not just in the book, but now this is from one of the responses that he wrote to a series of the different reviews that came out at the time. As one of the historian pointed out, my interests have never been confined exclusively to the nonprofit sector. And as he suggests, this has permitted me to bring a broader perspective to the institutions found in that sector. I like to think that this is true. This is perhaps less surprising, however, than the reverse point. Studying the nonprofit sector with care gives one important insight into institutions outside that sector, including the familiar business corporations that dominate contemporary economic activity. As the author of all three reviews observe, the analytic thread that runs through the entire book had their origins in my early work on nonprofits. And I was just wondering if any of you want to speak a little further to how that type of going deep and then broad and then deep again in those other areas might be productively used or could be productively used in other ways today to enrich scholarly debate. We're in some ways much more interdisciplinary. Law schools are now full with a bunch of people who have PhDs in all kinds of other fields. And yet I don't see as much work being done that has a simultaneous impact on so many different domains as this book clearly had at the time. So I was wondering, and John, you're of course free to jump into, you can wave or raise your hand. And to everybody else on Zoom, you can use the raise hand function because we're about to go to Q&A for a few minutes. If any of you wanted to jump in on the methodological contributions that you noticed as you went back and revisited.
I would just sort of in elaborating what you said, would raise part of it is the depth of knowledge of the institutions that he's studying. So economics that is not connected to the reality of institutions doesn't go as far as something, and just, I don't know if people have relooked at it, but I was relooking at every footnote this time. Maybe I didn't look at them that closely the first time, but the sources, the level of research is done, whether it's interviews or, statistical data, certainly help you build up into that the breadth and depth of, as you described, of the analysis. So we could add that. But as I said in my remarks, right, that was the point. Like you think about dispersed shareholders and our non-distribution constraint, right, in nonprofits, and they're not that far away when you think about the kind of control they exercise over boards.
Yeah, right.
I would just echo what some of the other panelists said about the lack of ideology in the book. It really does try and grapple with the world as it is and understand it through the lens of the framework, but there's never a hint of, I'm gonna shoehorn reality into this framework, which I certainly, have been tempted to do in my own work at various points, and I hope I have carried forth the dispassionate, objective, scientific approach that Henry's an exemplar of.
All right, with that, do you want to?
There's one. This is a question to Henry or to people who know his work better than I do. But one extraordinary feature of the book is that it doesn't get onto the shareholder maximization of shareholder value train. The book is a quite, I think, is singular in adopting a framework that's conducive to it and was used for that purpose by lots of people. But Henry has a deep understanding of what used to be called managerial capitalism, where the managers are largely self-governing, subject to product market discipline and a series of fiduciary responsibilities and norms. And I think there's a background understanding in Henry's work of how these institutions actually work, which conditions his larger judgments about what's going on and therefore also what's possible. And it's very, I found myself intrigued by that and wondering how he did it. Maybe he'd met some shareholders that he didn't like, that would help. But there's a capacity. The equilibrium comes from it isn't just that it's a one hand or the other. There's an equilibrium with some kind of direct experience of how things work that rule out a bunch of interpretations, which thank goodness should have been ruled out.
Can I go tell that?
Of course.
I'm gonna make a claim. I don't know if this claim is true. If you pick up the last 20 law review articles written on corporate governance, you can sort 18 out of 20. Again, I'm making this up. 18 out of 20 can be sorted into the shareholder rights camp, let's call it, and the managerialist camp. That really is a key cleavage in how corporate law academics approach corporate governance. But here's a question: which camp is ownership of enterprise in? The answer is, I think it's in neither. And I think that, and this is, picking up on what Chuck said, it really does reflect, ideology-free, or it transcends some of these cleavages that perhaps, not to throw aspersions at anyone, but perhaps might have unintentionally developed into having some ideological aspects to them. And that's sort of interesting. I don't know how Henry thinks about where the book fits in that camp, in that cleavage of scholarship.
All right, to Henry, and then anybody else has questions, please feel free to start raising your hands. You're good.
So I will at some later point offer my thanks for this remarkable outpouring here, and I'll just go straight to talking about the modern firm circa 25 years ago. When I looked at business corporations, the first thing I saw was that was the treatment of labor. General Motors would hire and fire 5,000 people in a week. They had 1 hour or so job tenure, and when the profits went down, when demand went down, they just laid off 12,000 workers or 20,000 workers or whatever. And I thought this was strange. I didn't know why they did it, and I thought I should figure it out. And I never did quite figure it out, but it became obvious to me that if you looked at General Motors circa 1955, let us say, the shareholders got a dividend of $2.34 per share, quarter after quarter after quarter for years on end. They bore none of the risk of the firm. Rather, all the risk of the firm was passed on to young workers in a seniority system. It's the young workers who get fired and rehired. So here we had this firm absorbing with the owners absorbing no risk, and the workers taking all the risk. And I didn't quite see it at the time, but we're looking at a nonprofit firm, really. The directors of the firm had no equity interest in the firm. They didn't get stock options and so forth. And the managers weren't paid with incentive compensation either. So we had a firm here that looked bizarre, and that's what I saw capitalism looking like. That's why I thought nonprofits were important and interesting, because you seem to find nonprofit firms at the heart of capitalism. And as several of you have suggested, I didn't approach the subject with some fondness for a particular organizational form, whether nonprofit or other. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a biologist, kind of a structural biologist, and that's what I became. I'm a guy who's interested in the animals in the zoo and what they look like and what makes them different from each other and so forth. And I don't have a strong stake in which one survives, but I would like to be able to predict it. But if you get credit for that, but so there's a reason why the book doesn't get cited much by lawyers, though it is the most cited. I was told some years ago that it was the most cited book in the American legal literature, most cited in the economics and in the social science literature, rather. That's because the word law scarcely ever appears in the book, and in fact, I was kind of worried that when I came up for tenure that it wouldn't get much credit because it wasn't really about law, and it really isn't about law, not very much anyway. So these are just different ways of saying that thank you. Yes, that you got the tone of the book, which is that I thought I was just telling stories about to justify what we saw out there, and we saw some odd things out there, like General Motors in 1955, and they require a little explanation. And of course, the explanation for the workers has to do with unions and union structures and who controls a union, and the fact the union is elected by 51% of the members, and it's easier to give power to the older members because they are more eager to have security than the young workers are, and you could a union could maintain, or a local of a union could maintain its role and its existence for a long time by following the interests of the most senior 51% of the workers, by accepting just enough risk for the workers that you'll never run the risk of firing anybody who's in the 51%, in the top 51% of the firm. So I'll shut up at this point because I'm having a great time. Let me tell you, hearing this, and I should go back and read the book too. So it sounds like it's full of great stuff. And I thank you all for taking that attitude. It's wonderful to be here, and I thank you all desperately.
All right, we still have a few minutes. I mean, I could go on right there, which is the role of law in creating both the option set and the switching costs, and whether we need to think more. But I see Naomi with her hand up, so let's go to the audience.
Henry's talking about labor right now, just suggested to me a 25 years out real question, which is right now we're watching all these people quit their jobs. throughout the economy and having this real labor shortage in important parts of the economy as a result. And I wanted to ask you, do you think then that you may have underestimated the extent of lock-in on the labor side, and that we're now seeing that it's much more profound than we thought before?
Well, the honest answer is no. I haven't thought about it, but I'd be delighted to share lunch with you and to find out more about it. One suspects that, of course, the role of work that has changed, the homogeneity of it has changed, the nature of risk sharing has changed, and this has got to change. The outcome of that summation that Ryan put on the screen up there. All the costs and benefits are changing, and we may be absorbing a lot of heterogeneity in these markets, in these relationships between the firm and the people that work with it or for it or on it. And of course, that should change the structure of enterprise. But I'd like to think a little bit harder about it before I decided how. So I look forward to learning more from the rest of you about these questions.
All right. I'm going to hear questions from Luigi and then Jeff, and I also want to give the panel a chance to respond.
So I wanted to elaborate on a comment by Ryan that I thought was very interesting. So you correctly pointed out that the optimal ownership structure depends on the underlying political institutions. But then we know that ownership structure impacts rents. And so now the political institutions that decide ownership probably have in mind also the distribution of rents. And so there is a political pressure to design political institutions that are not necessarily delivering an ownership that is optimal in some sense, but except that cater to the most powerful political actors. So going down that path, which I find very interesting, really, in a sense, undermines the happy view that ownership is efficient, everything thinks, and then nothing is political. In fact, you're saying exactly the opposite. That is so politically driven that we don't even realize that.
All right, and I'm going to ask Ryan to hold his response. We're going to hear from Jeff, and then I'm going to go back to the panelists in the reverse of the original order with any closing thoughts.
This is really a Henry question. So there's the book, which, as he says, is a biologist's book. There's the end of history, which some have taken as a as having an endpoint, a substantive claim that has sort of value-laden description about it. So, there's potentially sort of a change in your view between the biologist's book and, the article that has been extremely well cited by lawyers, even if the book hasn't been. And so I wonder how you would put those two themes together, one in which you're agnostic about the forms that ownership takes, the other in which you seem to have a strong view as to what the endpoint will be in an evolutionary sense as to ownership and other elements. And what do you think now?
Well, that's a question I knew was coming. That article on the end of history was, of course, designed as to be a pincushion, to be a citation magnet, and we succeeded wildly in that. It is by far, by a large margin, by many multiples, the most cited article that I or Krochman have ever written. And of course, it gets cited for the title. Nobody's read the thing. And it gets cited for the title, which was chosen to have the qualities that it has, which is to beat Fischel and Easterbrook in the citation count business. And we had to take kind of Easterbrook and Fischel view of things to do that. The paper, I put it to you that if you look, read, if you do look at the content of the article, it compares the, it looks at three comparisons, a worker-dominated style model for the firm, which is a model in which co-determination or some strong form of employee representation in the decision-making portions of the firm is compelled by law, and the second is a state-oriented model in which the state itself, a la France or Japan at the time, controlled a good bit the management of the firm, the direction in which it went, and then there was a shareholder-oriented model. If you look at these three, our description of these three alternatives, they're rather caricatured and have no obvious means of mechanism for change. And we thought that given the current technologies we could see, something that looks like, we didn't use the word shareholder primacy, but what we call the shareholder-oriented model, which we saw something about halfway between England and the United States at the time, was likely to survive. And I still think so, because the technology is so driven toward shareholder, I hate to say shareholder value maximization because I don't want to sign on to that camp, but organization pushes us in that direction, I think. After all, it can't be that hard to manage a business firm under the shareholder model. You just got to maximize a number, the present discounted value of the future net cash flows. And you got to maximize that number. You got a number out there, just a number. And it's got to be pretty easy, not much room for debate about it, and not much room for disagreement about it either. You know whether the the managers are maximizing that number or not. Other people can calculate it, and I think it's going to be a long time before we find that we can. There are other ownership patterns that challenge that form of ownership, simply because it is so easy to run a business school with that model. I think it's such a simple objective function and such an easily calculable one. You can, of course, it commodifies everybody. It commodifies all the workers. You can ask for a worker, does he add to the number or not? And if he doesn't add to the number, you just get rid of him. If we ever develop thicker, as Chuck says, ever develop thicker notions of the relationships within firms, maybe that simple numerical maximization exercise won't be so salient. But until then, I think it will be. I will say, moreover, that going back to the article, that I challenge you to find a falsifiable sentence in the article. It was carefully written. It doesn't say when the end will happen. It could be tomorrow, or it could be 3 centuries from now. The paper's a little loose about that, and as it is about most other elements of the firm that it talks about. It's once you get beyond the title, it's not all that exciting, really. And it was designed not to be, but maybe we went too far with the piece, but I still I'll still back what it says in beyond the title, or even the title in the vague sense in which we give it to be interpreted. So I'll let it go with that.
All right. Well, now we also have methodological insight over how to get cited a lot and still not proven wrong. All right. With that, I want to give it back to each of our different panelists who kicked this off so well. So Chuck, do you want to? So
let me, two points again. First on this question, I think Henry is being disingenuous when he describes himself as a biologist who doesn't have much stake in the outcome. It's true that this is There's an adaptive element, a strong adaptive element, and Henry has provided the selection environment under which adaptation takes place. That's the really strong contribution of the book, is to say how, for example, interests within otherwise homogeneous groups of patrons have a strong effect on the distribution of control rights and so on. So there's a selection environment, and therefore there's a biological aspect. But it's also the case that the environment within which selection is not the selection criteria, but the very environment within which selection is taking place is subject to human intervention, including intervention that derives from observation about what the consequences of letting untrammeled adaptation take place would be. So, you know, if there's a populist dispersion of shareholding in the United States, and something Henry talks about, that's a political act, and it has consequences for the way firms are run, the distribution of rights, and so on. So, and we face a giant choice of that kind because we have a set of biological conditions that are conducing firms to adopt dirty technology, and we understand that if we let them adapt the most efficient solutions under present selection criteria, they're going to put an end to the planet. So, okay, so it's the interplay of these two. That's the first thing. The second thing is I'm less unsanguine, more sanguine about the evolution of the this, I'm going to call it productive community, even though it's not a term that Henry uses. But if you think about what the patrons in their ensemble constitute, they are a productive community, and it's their interactions which determine the shape of the firm. Because I think that, let me just one illustration for many. Apple Computer, the Apple Corporation has no general managers. Underneath the board, the very top level, everyone in Apple, there's no one who's responsible for the P&A of the iPad or the iMac. There are only subject domains where the person at the top of the domain is an expert in that domain and has come up through the ranks and solves problems in that domain. And the reason for that, the reason there are no general managers of the kind that Sloan told us were indispensable to the modern corporation, is precisely because the forms of collaboration are so deep. They require such subtle judgments about unfolding technological possibilities that only someone who is immersed in that kind of problem solving can actually give direction. So I think that once you expand the nature of where, you know, let's call them the adaptive forces, to rejoin the first part of the answer, the adaptive forces of the firm are pushing. If you combine that with the need for a political oversight and intervention, I see a brighter future for a proliferation of new forms of ownership and control.
Roberta, a minute.
So I see the ownership of enterprise as an example of the new math, that 1 + 1 is greater than 2. So the individual pieces, whether it's the one on mutual insurance companies, clubs, going backwards order, the one we both emphasized in Leo that introduces theory of corporations and nonprofits, each of them was their own contribution. But when they're put together in the book and the way they're woven together, it's a much broader contribution. And he makes it look simple, but it's actually built up from a very carefully and precisely theory of depth and breadth that's working from economic theory to institutions to the facts on the ground and then back up to theory. It's almost like, you know, when you think about these things as a virtuous cycle.
All right, Ryan, a minute.
Yeah, just to reflect in reaction to Luigi's really interesting changing of the perspective. So a different talk that someone ought to give today, I hope someone gives, is a political economy perspective on ownership of enterprise. My talk very much took a normative, you know, what is optimal policy? but it gives me an opportunity to say that so Henry's theory is very much an efficiency theory where efficiency is used as the engine of a positive account rather than as a normative criterion. That's how to understand Henry's theory. And that's, of course, a classic move in law and economics. We're all familiar with using efficiency as a positive account, as well as a normative criterion. Interestingly, there's a competitor book. I think we should now admit there's a competitor book. I'm going to characterize it this way just to be provocative, which is Mark Rowe's, what is it? Strong Managers, Weak Owners. And I think the subtitle of Mark's, is Mark here?
He's right there.
Before I
let me jump in. Weak owners, strong managers. Let's get the causal.
Sorry, I have backwards. Now I got to change what I'm going to say now that I know that Mark is present. I'm just kidding, Mark. I'm just kidding. I think the subtitle is like a political account of American corporate finance. Huh? What is it? Is that right? Is that the subtitle? All right, I'm close. Mark takes, in essence, up the question posed by Luigi, and I'm going to claim that's the case. Clearly, there's a close relationship. And that's a different explanatory lens for thinking about essentially the same set of institutions that are the focus of Henry's analysis. I guess Mark's book predated Henry's book. So interest, or certainly Mark's work on the subject predated Henry's book. So you might think, going back full circle to characterizing Henry's book, you might think that Henry would view this as there's a horse race. Here's this theory, but I've got this theory, and I'm going to show how my theory is the better theory. Not at all. And so I just reread this recently, and Henry incorporates and cites too, I should say, Mark's account. Again, I think this just illustrates the open-mindedness of the account, which I think I certainly can learn from. I'll stop there.
All right, John, 1 minute to close us out.
Conscious of the fact that I'm all that's between you all and coffee, I'll keep this really brief. And I wanted just to make two observations. One is on a methodological, and I really very much agree, and I think Roberta characterized it beautifully, the interplay between the different distinct contributions and between theory and the real world. And this, the point I want to make is simply that Henry is very modest about the legal content of the book, but the methodology of taking things in their full complexity. So not starting with stylized facts, but saying, look, let's actually embrace the complexity that's out there that we're trying to explain, and then let's take that back and inductively drill that down to a theoretical account that helps us understand what's going on. That's, I think, inherently a methodology that lawyers are very familiar with. That's how lawyers try to explain legal data. And so there is an element of the methodology that is probably more at home with lawyers than in the social science departments where the book has been so frequently cited. Then the second point I wanted to make really is this point about politics and the future of things like the climate crisis and where disagreement or difference in perspective on this maybe boils down to different accounts of the functioning of the political environment. So Ryan's recharacterization or broader framing of the optimization formula, I think, is a very good way of thinking about this, because we can say, well, look, if there's two different, as a positive matter, if there are two, if we have different conceptions of what's politically feasible, then we have different results as to what is the where we think the forces that Henry describes will lead to organizational outcomes.
All right. With that, we'll have coffee. We'll try to meet here at 11:05. But first, join me in thanking all four of our panelists for doing a great job starting off this conversation. Thank you.